Well, I'd like to welcome you to another of our Institute Encounters, interviews with the distinguished scholars that the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization brings in to Texas Tech. I'm Steve Balch, the Institute Director. Our guest today is Professor John Walbridge. He is Professor of Near Eastern Languages and Director of the Graduate Program at Indiana University. He is an authority on, among many things, later Islamic philosophy, and he is the author of several books, among which are The Caliphate of Reason, The Leaven of the Ancients, which is a discussion of the philosophy of a 12th century Muslim thinker named Yahya Suhrawardi, and finally the wisdom of the ancient mystics, or the Mystic East, the wisdom of the Mystic East, which sounds like a men's club in the Midwest somewhere, but
could be.
But I know, and in point of fact, having read it, that it's a kind of very interesting account of Suhrawardi and his followers and his legacy in Islamic thought. So maybe you could begin by telling us how you first got interested in the history of Islamic philosophy and thought.
Well, I started college planning to major in physics and discovered that I wasn't smart enough to do theoretical physics, and anyway, I didn't have quite enough math, and moved to philosophy.
That's a predicament many of us have faced.
Well, that's life. I got interested in religion and taken a year off of college. And when I went back, I took a course. I got interested in Islam, took Arabic, took courses on the history of Islam, and then went on from there. Then when I went to graduate school, strangely enough, I went off for a year in Beirut after my undergraduate degree was finished, and then went back to Harvard. But when I was in Beirut, we spent my wife and I spent Christmas in Cairo, and ran into a professor from the department at Harvard I was going to. I asked him what I should do when I got there. He said, well, come see me, which I did. And he said, well, you can take my course on Islamic political philosophy and my course on Al-Farabi, and you can do Persian if you want. And, but I'd had background in ancient philosophy, which meant that I actually was equipped to work on Islamic philosophy. So, and then it went on from there. I was also interested in Iran.
I'm sure many of our viewers are wondering why the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization is interested itself in Islamic philosophy, and there are many reasons that we are, but one of them, of course, is that as much as later Western philosophy did, Islamic philosophy has its roots in the Greek and Hellenistic world, and therefore shares an important point of origin with Western civilization. So tell us a little bit about that connection. I suspect a lot of our viewers know next to nothing about Islamic philosophy. How is Islamic philosophy indebted to the philosophy of Greece?
To sort of put it a bit crudely, you can look at Islamic philosophy as very late antique philosophy. It carried on from pretty much without a break from the philosophy of the later Roman Empire. The books that were translated and read were Aristotle and his commentators in particular. What had happened is that the Muslim Empire was established very suddenly in the 7th century. And first of all, the areas that the Muslims conquered were civilized places, and people had read these authors for many centuries. And then as things settled down, the Muslim elites realized that they needed scientific information, medicine, astronomy, mechanics, and with that came philosophy, and that was picked up by Muslim philosophers, and in fact that tradition carries on to this day, particularly in Iran.
But there was actually, if I recall correctly, a certain amount of what we certainly could refer to as philosophizing going on in the Islamic world prior to the beginning of the great translations, the Mutazilites, the Asharites. That's basically a philosophic conflict, is it not?
It's philosophical or theological. Obviously, for Muslims, like for Christians, one of the great philosophical and theological problems that they faced was how to reconcile philosophy with monotheistic revealed religions. So much of Islamic philosophy is just plain philosophy, ontology and logic and things like that, but the question of the relationship between reason and revelation was a central problem. Now, it is quite true that Muslims had begun thinking about some of these issues before the translation movement got really started, but as I said, they were they were ruling a society where these kind of ideas had been circulating for centuries, so it's not surprising that they would be engaged with them.
Who were the most important philosophers for these earlier Islamic thinkers in the Greek tradition?
Well, Aristotle above all, and the commentators on Aristotle. They didn't translate Plato directly, although they had some summaries of Plato. There were some Neoplatonic works that were translated or adapted, but Aristotle was most important, since Aristotle gave really the most comprehensive explanation of the natural world of any philosopher up until modern times. And by the end of the Roman Empire, Aristotle's thought was thoroughly integrated with scientific thought of various sorts.
Now, this was sort of equally true for most of the schoolmen of Europe, the Latin philosophers of the Middle Ages.
Right. It was true, except that the Latin philosophers misplaced most of these books for 400 or 500 years.
Right. But when they get them back,
yes,
Aristotle is as central to them, is he not?
Oh yes, and they use Muslim philosophers to understand Aristotle. The most prominent example is Averroes, who had written comprehensive commentaries on most of Aristotle's works, which the Latins studied avidly.
They called him the commentator, did they not?
They called him the commentator,
yeah.
Exactly. That was the authority. They also studied Avicenna. One of my more learned Muslim graduate students once sniffed to me that really Aquinas was just Avicenna.
Now, Avicenna has a very special role, doesn't he, in the philosophy that follows? Is he like Aquinas, or more prominent than Aquinas is?
He is more fundamental to Islamic philosophy than any single medieval European philosophers to the West. It would be more akin to, let's say, Descartes for modern philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is that Aristotle is hard to understand. As my students are currently complaining, seminar we're reading Aristotle along with particularly Avicenna. And Avicenna had an exceptionally well-organized, clear mind, and so his synthesis of Aristotelian thought simply supplanted the works of Aristotle, and then everybody else thereafter effectively started with him.
Were the works of Aristotle still available?
They gradually passed out of out of use and then disappeared. I mean, in a manuscript culture, you have to keep recopying things or books disappear, and it's a lot of trouble to copy a book. So you copy the books that you're going to use, the ones that are now out of date. If they survive, it's in rare copies.
So, if you're relying upon Avicenna to get your Aristotle, first off, are you aware that Avicenna is building on Aristotle?
Oh yeah, there's no question.
He's clear about that himself.
Oh yeah, he's quite clear. He talks there. He actually has an autobiography, which you don't usually have in the Islamic world. He talks about his studies and the books he read. He mentions that he read Aristotle's Metaphysics 40 times without understanding it, which I can believe.
And what happened on the 41st?
Well, before he read it the 41st time, he ran into a bookseller in the market who was sold him a book by Al-Farabi, who was the previous major Islamic philosopher, called The Intentions of Aristotle's Metaphysics. And he said that explained everything. And I mean, there's a point to this. I was in a seminar in, of all places, Beijing in China, with an American Aristotle expert and a Chinese graduate students who were reading the Metaphysics, and I was following it in Aquinas' commentary and in Avicenna's Metaphysics, and Avicenna clarifies a lot of things that are kind of muddy in Aristotle.
Does he do a better job than Aquinas? Do you think he understands Aristotle better?
I think they're in the same league. But, I liked Aquinas' commentary.
So, of course, Thomas Aquinas had Avicenna.
He did, yes, and had read them and quotes him.
What did Avicenna do with Aristotle? It's more than simply a kind of commentary. He develops his own takes on certain of the issues.
He does, and some things he has an advantage in Arabic, which makes certain issues clearer. So Greek is a little bit ambiguous, like being, that concept. It's unclear in English and Greek whether you're talking about something that's happening or something that is. And in Arabic, it's very, very clear that it's a difference between existence, which is something that, in effect, something does, and an existent, which is a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he's very clear with his language, and I guess that he has a very, very clear mind.
So he clarifies things in Aristotle.
Plus he
correctly clarifies, you think?
Well, he disagrees with Aristotle on occasion, but he knows what he's doing, and he actually probably had access to more of the ancient commentators on Aristotle than we do now.
I see. What does he add, if anything, to Aristotle?
A certain, a considerable degree of clarity. I mean, he is an Aristotelian. There is some Neoplatonic cosmology that he uses. I mean, Aristotle's cosmology is not very satisfactory to a monotheist. It's 47 or 56 gods, some two arbitrary numbers, depending on how many Aristotle thought you needed to make the heavens go around. And for, sort of God talk, the Neoplatonists were better, so that gets added in. But on some of the basic issues, he's very much in the tradition of Aristotle.
He accepts, for example, Aristotle's view about the eternity of the universe.
Yes.
Which kind of, on the surface, seems to conflict with the Quran's account of
it does. Creation. I mean, although his arguments for the eternity of the universe are really Neoplatonic rather than Aristotelian.
So God is sort of outside of the universe, creating time and space?
God is the first cause, and he doesn't do much else. This was a major point of dispute with the theologians.
And he therefore also argues, if I recall, that God didn't know about specific things. He only had universal concepts.
Right. He doesn't know about my sins. He may know about sin in general, but he doesn't know what I was doing last night.
So how did this affect the reception of Avicenna?
Well, one thing is indicated in the terminology. So the original word for philosophy in Arabic was falsafa, which obviously is just a loan word from Greek, and that tends to drop out of use and gets replaced by hikmah, which means wisdom, which is a good Quranic term. Although actually it has, I noticed recently, it has precedent in Aristotle's metaphysics. Where he calls metaphysics Sophia, which was hikmah, which is wisdom. The falsafa, philosophy sort of acquired a sort of sense of, okay, these people are atheists, because they believe in the eternity of the world. If the world always existed, it didn't have a creator. So he gets attacked, and very famously by El-Ghazali. Avicenna died, I think it was 1037. Ghazali died in 1111, so he's about a century later. Ghazali writes a very biting critique of philosophy, which Averroes then responds to. It's a book called, Ghazali's book is called Havet al-Philosophy, which means the incoherence of the philosophers. It's basically an argument that the philosophers don't know what they're talking about, and their arguments are unsound and contradict each other. And, Averroes writes Havet at which means the incoherence of the incoherence, which he defends Aristotle. But what happens within a century after El-Ghazali is that the Muslim theologians get very, very heavily involved with philosophy. So the most important theologian of the next century, a man named Fakhruddin Razi, writes a large commentary on Avicenna's last book, which generally attacks Avicenna. That receives a super commentary by somebody about 75 years later who defends Avicenna, and then a generation or two after that, there's someone else who tries to reconcile these two commentaries, and there have been dozens of commentaries on this book in the centuries since.
Now, Suhrawardi, who is the thinker that you have most studied, represents a continuation of philosophizing, though with a strong religious current in it, and it's rather different from what Avicenna had been doing. And maybe you could tell us about that.
Probably, insofar as I understand it so far. Suhrawardi was born in about the 1150s. He was sort of an interesting character. He was a dervish, a kind of wandering monk, and known as a kind of brilliant eccentric even in his own time. He ends up having one of Saladin's sons as his disciple. Saladin, who's very much an orthodox Sunni, does not take this well and orders Suhrawardi killed. So he is dead by his late 30s. Now, what Suhrawardi was doing, he was trained as an Aristotelian, Avicennan Aristotelian. Much of what he writes is in the Avicennan tradition. So he writes some fairly conventional surveys of philosophy in the style of Avicenna. By and large, taking his position. And then, in the midst of this, he writes this brilliant book called The Philosophy of Illumination, which has two things. First of all, it has a critique of earlier thinkers, particularly Avicenna and his followers. He refers to them as the followers of the Peripatetics, by which he means Avicenna and his followers, but to some extent also the theologians who were atomists. And he doesn't approve of that either. So he criticizes Avicenna on certain fundamental points on issues like ontology, epistemology, very much philosophical, classical philosophical issues.
Not accusing him of being an atheist.
No, because he has the same opinions. He believes in the eternity of the world for much the same reason that Avicenna did. And then the other half of the book is this account of the cosmos in terms of light and darkness, very much a Neoplatonic kind of treatment. What everybody reads at this point, however, are allegories that he wrote probably as quite a young man, which are in very fine early New Persian. Iranians to this day still read them in high school as part of their Persian literature classes. But as a philosopher, he basically is he's a Neoplatonist and a critic of Avicenna. And then this critique gets picked up by later people who are either defending Avicenna or accepting Suhrawardi's criticisms.
Perhaps you could explain what it means to be a Neoplatonist.
Well, if you ask a Neoplatonist, he'll say that what it means is that he's a follower of Plato. Neoplatonism is our word, not theirs. In practice in the Islamic world, what it means is a theory of the cosmos in which there is a first cause, which you can identify with God, who emanates everything else. So it gives you a kind of pyramidal structure of existence. So you have hierarchies of levels of being, and they get more complex the farther down the pyramid you go. And to some extent, almost all of the Muslim philosophers adopted Neoplatonic ideas for cosmology. And to some extent, even the theologians did as well.
Were they aware that this was an elaboration of Platonic ideas? Do they know who Plotinus was?
They had heard of Plotinus.
Who was really the kind of author of Neoplatonism in the sense
Right,
you just
of course,
described it.
as I said,
And he's
Plotinus
a
would have said...
century AD guy, isn't
Yes,
he? Yeah.
yes, but he would have said he was a Platonist.
Uh-huh.
Actually, I would say he was a Platonist too. But there was a book, it's an adaptation of selections from Plotinus's work that's circulated in Arabic called the Theology of Aristotle.
So they actually thought this was Aristotle, too.
Yes, some people did, not everybody, but...
What about Suhrawardi? Did
Suhrawardi probably did, although he identified with Plato rather than with Aristotle.
He realized that there was a difference between the two.
Yeah, they knew.
They thought theology was a very late work in which Aristotle had kind of repented.
That's sort of the theory. I once described it as the fourth of Jaeger's 3 stages of Aristotle's development. It's what Aristotle ought to have written.
So Suhrawardi is kind of carrying this tradition on, and he becomes then pretty foundational for subsequent mainstream Islamic philosophy.
Right. Everybody sort of takes a position with respect to him. You could compare him to Kant in the modern Western philosophical tradition. You can disagree with Kant, but you can't simply pretend he didn't exist.
Is he taken is Suhrawardi regarded as an alternative to Avicenna?
Well, there are people to this day in Iran who are sort of Orthodox Avicennians,
Mm.
and then the most important school is identified with a man named Lassadra, who was 17th century Iranian philosopher, very, very major figure. And he argued that Suhrawardi was wrong in his critique of Avicenna's theory of existence. And essentially, Lassadra was kind of a monist, so what exists is existence, and it's differentiated. It's called the primacy of existence. It's how
And as you move away from God, who is pure existence, and get more and more sort of imperfect existence, you kind of move into our world.
Yes, but it all is sort of waves of the sea,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and there's one sea.
Mm-hmm.
The opponents are called they're said to have upheld the doctrine of the primacy of quiddity, which basically it's a less popular position, but it's identified with Suhrawardi, and they're that I think basically claims that what exists are concrete individuals, and that Suhrawardi's critique was that concepts like existence, quiddity, necessity are things that our mind uses to explain experience, sort of like Kant's categories.
Which in some deeper sense is a seamless web.
Well, the world is made up of, for Suhrawardi's, at least as I understand him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's made up of individual things.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's not light as a kind of stuff that you make things
Mm-hmm.
out of, but there's lights.
Mm-hmm.
So, God is a light, the light of lights. The human mind is a light. But they're also dark things. So body is a kind of dark entity, and then there are light and dark accidents that exist in minds and in concrete things. But what there is out there are individual things, me and you and the chairs and the tables that philosophers always talk about.
So if you take a look at, I've been listening to Peter Adamson's discussion of Islamic philosophy, and his example is usually a giraffe.
Okay.
But be that as it may. If you take the Islamic scholastic tradition and you look at what the scholastics during the later medieval period were doing in Europe, they're both working with Aristotle and in varying degrees some other, like Plato, Plotinus, other thinkers of the ancient world. But are they doing markedly different things, or at least is there a different emphasis in what they're doing?
Well, there's certainly a different emphasis. Some of it is institutional. So in Europe, they didn't, for what strike me as quite sound reasons, they didn't allow graduate students to teach theology. And so for the bright young people, we're doing a lot of work in logic and natural philosophy.
Meaning what we would say is science.
Science, yeah.
Proto-science. Yeah.
Proto-science, philosophy of science, but not talking about the nature of the Trinity or so forth, which was reserved for their betters. In the Islamic world, the emphasis was different. What was taught of philosophy, first of all, logic. Everybody studied logic, East and West. The emphasis was different. The supreme subject in Western Europe was theology, and with philosophy being a handmaiden to theology. In the Islamic world, it was law. So if you were a very talented student and wanted to be an academic in the West, you went on to be a professor of theology. Your counterpart in the Islamic world would teach a discipline called usul al-fiqh, which is the principles of law. It's basically the rules for deducing new legal rulings. And a lot of logical thought took place in that discipline. So, semantics, for instance. So, the reason is that Islam is a legalistic religion. There is no provision for new legislation, so all new cases have to be dealt with by deduction from materials that date from the time of the Prophet, or are supposed to date from the time.
Now,
of the
there
Prophet.
is theology. And,
There is theology.
Rational theology, too. Was it
Yes.
Kalam was involved? So how does that differ from, say, the theology of the schoolmen in Europe, which also is wedded to, if not is supported by philosophy?
It depends on the date. The earlier theology as a discipline conceived itself as a tool for defending the faith. So it was essentially a dialectical discipline. Its purpose was to show heretics and unbelievers that they were wrong and prove the true faith was true. It was not interested in pursuing absolute truth for its own sake.
So it's that forensic philosophy or something.
Defensive philosophy, perhaps. Well, the dialectic is what the philosophers called it.
Mm-hmm.
But around the year 1200, there was a major shift, and the theologians became much more involved with philosophy, much more concerned with issues that really had nothing much to do with religion. Atomism, causality, things like that, and they studied Avicenna in school.
What produces that change?
I think that people like Ghazali criticizing philosophy convinced their students that philosophy was something they needed to know about.
Did it have to do with the development of drasas as well, where there's a kind of more formal scheme of intellectual training?
It's probably as the madrasas emerged at roughly the same time. So to take an example, Ghazali, is a great critic of philosophy, wrote a manual on the principles of law, and which was, I am told by people who study that discipline, very influential. But he had a 60-page introduction on logic. Okay, since then there have been plenty of other such manuals, but none of them have introductions on logic. And the reason is everybody had already studied logic. So there's a story I dug out of an Indian Islamic source about a kid who's poor family who went off to the madrasa. When he came home for vacation, his father asked him, "Well, son, what have you been studying?" The son said, I've been studying logic. His father says, "Well, what's logic?" He said, "Well, it's a very useful discipline." In the meantime, they've sat down to share one egg for dinner. As I said, it was a poor family. And the son says, "Well, for example, using logic, I can prove that this one egg is actually two." And he gives this very complicated answer that his father fails to comprehend. His father listens and says, "Ah, well then I will eat this egg, you eat the other one."
There's a kind of resentment of intellectuals all over the world.
Well, this probably came from people at the madrasas who made fun of themselves as well.
So in the Islamic world, philosophy sort of infiltrates theology.
Yes.
And changes its nature. So it's now dealing with more abstract problems and metaphysical problems and epistemological problems. So how is that different from what theology and philosophy are doing at about the same time in the West?
There's certain amount of formal differences. So because of the way universities were organized medieval logic developed new branches in a way that didn't happen in the Islamic world. But I think that's because much of what the medieval Europeans considered logic was actually being done in other disciplines, particularly law. So questions like semantics, for instance, what's the relationship between a word and a statement and a meaning.
Does Western university legal training in the Middle Ages involve logic, instruction in logic as well?
Everybody took it.
Everybody took it.
Yeah, it was the basic. Logic and natural philosophy were the core of the medieval university curriculum. And madrasas were much the same, although they had a lot, well, obviously they had a lot more Arabic. And I don't think the medieval universities had the kind of intense study of Latin.
So in the West, is theology philosophized too? Is it sort of same thing, more or less, happening in both spheres?
Yes, but in the West, theology is more central in a way that it never became in the Islamic world. Law remained the queen of the sciences in the Islamic world, whereas theology was in the West.
How do you think that has affected the sort of religious practice and belief in the two civilizations? The fact that one, you have this integration of philosophy and theology, and in the other, you have the same thing, but theology isn't quite as important. Instead, what you have is an emphasis on law. So what larger intellectual consequence might that have for the two civilizations?
Well, obviously, in both civilizations, there was a lot of diversity. So given that, I think to this day, if you ask a Christian what is a good Christian, he'll say, well, he's a good person and he's kind to his neighbors, and he's accepted Jesus Christ as his personal Savior, or he goes to Mass every Sunday, and follows the teachings of the church. If you ask a Muslim, who's a good Muslim, he'll say, well, he fasts in Ramadan, he goes to the Friday prayers in the mosque, he prays 5 times a day. So the Christian's more likely to cite belief in Muslims' publicly visible behavior.
Is that because the theology of Islam has fewer doctrines to it than in the West?
It's because I think the doctrines don't matter as much. You can see a really concrete example in the Sufis, the Muslim mystics. So you take probably the greatest, well, certainly the greatest mystical theologian of the whole Islamic history is a man named Ibn Arabi, who was a Spanish Muslim of Arab descent, as his name indicates. He had this very elaborate system in which everything was a manifestation of the names and attributes of God. And when he interpreted the Quran, he was a kind of a hyper-literalist. He was kind of like the Kabbalah. So he would make arguments like, the Quran says Noah preached to his people, but they didn't listen. And Ibn Arabi says, well, the reason they didn't listen was because they understood something that Noah didn't. Noah was just preaching about the transcendence of God, but his people, with their idols, understood the immanence of God, that he was present in the world, and if Noah had properly preached both aspects of God, they would have been converted. This would have earned you burning at the stake in Europe. But it was controversial among people who were capable of reading such things. Nobody got burned at the stake, and the ordinary people looked at people like Ibn Arabi. Was this man a good Muslim or not? They're not reading these massive books. He's in the mosque every day. He's there Thursday night. He's reciting the Quran all the time, and reciting names of God under his breath. This is a good Muslim. Look at him.
So in the West, you're suggesting philosophy creates problems because it makes the structure of religious belief much more precise and complicated, and hence there are more ways in which heretics can fall afoul of the received opinion of the church than is likely to happen in the East, where you could get into similar trouble by disobeying the law?
Mostly you didn't, unless you were really blatant. The clergy did not control handling crime. That was the business of the king, and the king had his own ideas about what constituted an offense that needed to be punished. Sometimes they overlapped, but kings didn't approve of thieves, and neither did theologians. But on the other hand, states did not normally enforce fasting and Ramadan. On the other hand, it was pretty well understood that if you're going to eat lunch in Ramadan, do it at home. It's still true.
Europe has in its earlier history certainly had various heresies that arose. Again, a complicated theology, one might think, would be a greater breeder of heresy than a relatively simple theology. You don't have the notion of the Trinity, for example. In the West, it's going to talk about that endlessly, or the dual personhood of God, things of that sort. The big split in the Islamic world is between it arises out of a dispute over the succession to the prophet, and who the leader of the world's Muslims really should be. And you have the two branches of Sunni and Shia, and dividing on that. Heretics were, until certainly the late Reformation and Enlightenment, treated pretty badly in most parts of Europe. How are Shia treated by Sunni in the realms that the Sunnis control, and vice versa?
Let's divide, say, 1978 on from everything.
No,
before.
I'm thinking back in traditional Islamic societies.
Usually, they left each other alone. It varied if there were political issues at stake. There might be persecutions of Shia or Sunnis. The time that happened, in the early caliphate, the 8th, 9th century, the state kept a pretty close eye on particularly the Shiites were descended from the Prophet, because they were potentially rival claimants to power. In the Ottoman period, Iran didn't become officially Shiite until after 1500. But once that happened, the position of the Shia who ended up in Ottoman territory was problematic. Although even that is complicated. The Sufi order, the mystical order that were the chaplains of the Janissaries, or basically the Ottoman equivalent of the Marine Corps, they were Shia, and they still exist in places like Albania.
So there was a view that this was a difference within the Muslim community, but they were all still Muslims in some way.
Generally, yes. There were people who said that the Shia were not Muslims, and every so often some theologian does a takfir, declares somebody a non-Muslim, and generally speaking, nobody else takes it very seriously.
Yeah, Al-Ghazali thought that people who believed what Avicenna did, even if they never said it, even if you only inferred it, deserved death, if I recall.
Right, if you leave Islam, that's a capital crime.
He thought they
Islamic
had.
law.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't do anything about
it. There was never a kind of enlightenment in Islamic history. Does that have anything to do, you think, with the more marginalized position of theology? That is to say, my argument would be, in the West, theology is central and is nonetheless infiltrated by philosophy. The theology, even without philosophy, is a pretty complicated theology.
Well, and of course, in Christianity emerged in an environment in which education, sort of elite education, was philosophy. So John Chrysostom, the great preacher of Constantinople, and Julian the Apostate, the last pagan Roman emperor, were
read the same stuff.
They were classmates.
No, well, their classmates said. So one would think that might have more of a destabilizing in the long-term influence on dogmatic religion.
You mean in the West?
Yes, because of, first of all, theology being more central, so a lot of people are attending to it. Then it involves, it's already complex.
Stakes are higher.
Well, I'm not sure the stakes offhand, but in any event, it's philosophy is part of it. That's likely to kind of lead to a lot of intellectual ferment over critical things. Whereas in the East, you have you certainly have strong belief, but it's not, in the sense of theology is more marginal. You're suggesting the belief is not quite as intellectualized, at least in the theoretical sense. It's understood as a body of practice with a few simple axioms about belief.
Tends to be, if you go to an Islamic bookstore, you will find, I mean, leaving aside the sort of fancy Qurans that you give as graduation presents and so on, you look at the serious books, they are commentaries on the Quran, hadith, it's the collections of the sayings of the Prophet, and books on law, and on subjects that in one way or another relate to law. There will be books on theology. I mean, you have popular books on what you're supposed to believe, of course, usually little pamphlets, but you don't, there's not a lot of shelf space devoted to the sort of classic works of Islamic theology.
So I guess what I'm wondering out loud is whether theology, in some sense, isn't bad for religion. That you have too much theology, which is going to, if you have a lot of it, is going to be much like philosophy, though, perhaps with rooted in supposedly in certain pivotal axioms. It's in a way you have a more stable religion if people are not thinking about its central maxims in the same way that theology invites you to think about it. C.S. Lewis once said, mere Christianity. I think he was sort of suggesting that a religion has a greater attraction and will be more important in people's lives if it's not over-intellectualized. And I'm wondering whether that is a difference between the West and Islam.
It could have a point. I mean, the reason that I'm American is because my ancestors were Protestant fanatics.
And came over on the Mayflower.
Some of them came on the Mayflower. Some of them were, the Walbridges apparently were on the run from Judge Jeffreys.
Oh, they had risen against.
They had risen against. There was King James.
Yeah, James.
And lost. So my genealogist cousin believes.
So might that make Islam really a kind of greater realm of faith than Christianity turned out to be, because the preoccupations were legal and not theological.
And the legal is, in some ways, the stakes were not as high. I mean, first of all, Muslims placed a great deal of value on the unity of the Muslim community. So Muslims will tell you in the face of all reasonable evidence that they are a united community.
Shia and Sunni.
Not invariably in modern times, but yes, and more often than not. Well, we're all Muslims, and that, so they tend to draw back when they feel themselves approaching something that will produce a schism. And one of the effects of that, and also, I mean, Muslim scholars were honest enough to know that much of what they were doing was a tissue of supposition. I mean, certainly that was the case in law. I mean, they knew what the Quran said in the 500 or so verses that mentioned something about law, but the Quran does not say anything about coffee. And if you're going to make a judgment about coffee, you're making an inference based on analogy, and the sort of assumptions pile on top of each other. And everybody, of any degree of sense understood that while we may all agree that a particular rule is what we ought to do, we know that we don't know. We know that we're responsible for making the best effort to follow the law of God, but there's no way we can know it perfectly. So there's that, and one of the ways they dealt with it is that sometimes they made surprising compromises. So in Sunni Islam, there are 4 legal schools, which basically hold different views about what God wants you to do. Mostly minor kinds of things. I've been studying Islam for nearly 50 years now, and I couldn't watch someone pray and tell you which school he belonged to. I mean, I could study and learn to do it, but I haven't. What's probably more surprising is that there are 7 equally authoritative versions of the Quran.
Do they differ much?
Not very much. They differ slightly. Some of the differences are in assumptions about dialect. So the version that's most commonly used, which was one used in Egypt and then adopted by the Saudis, who print a lot of Qurans, the word for believers is mu'mineen, but the version used in Morocco is mu'mineen. So a o has been replaced by an u. Things like that. There's things, active versus passive, things like that. But, I mean, this is scripture, so, people have argued about less.
Mm-hmm.
But, Muslims sort of, rather than fight about the text of the Quran, they sort of tidied it up. And a scholar about 400 years after the Prophet came up with this system that, 7 versions, and each of them has 2 slight variants. And then there are 3 other versions that are almost as authoritative, and another 4 that you can look at if you want. But the point was not to have a schism over the text of the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that. There's a tendency to avoid open splits. It's not to say there aren't disputes, but
Now, why do you think that's less true in Christianity? Because
it was true for a long time, obviously, and starting at least in the West, the church stayed united until about the 11th century, when the Orthodox and the Latin split. And then, of course, the Protestant Reformation was probably unwise idea that people should be able to decide for themselves what the Bible means.
mm-hmm.
It's caused endless trouble, some of it done by my ancestors.
That's not true in Islam. If you're a believer, you look to the ulema to tell you what it means.
Yeah, and as I said, in some ways, what matters is that you make a sincere attempt to get it right.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, that means going to the ulama, to the to the clergy. Now, in modern times, it's changing. Um, First of all, you have widespread literacy in a way that you didn't before. So, 200 years ago, anybody who could read the Quran with some degree of understanding would also have had some degree of formal religious training. That's not true anymore. And all of the key texts in the Islamic tradition, particularly the foundational texts, the Quran, the collections of the Prophet's sayings, are pretty much available to any educated Muslim. They're available in English in all the major Islamic languages. Actually, nowadays, English is the most important Islamic
They're
language.
very voluminous.
They're very voluminous, but anybody can read them, and you've started now to have problems like we did 500 years ago in the Protestant Reformation, where people were saying, but the priest was telling me this, but it doesn't say that in the Bible.
Is if you look at Islam today, is the radicalism in part due to the fact that more and more people are kind of reading these things and making up their own minds as to what's there?
Oh yeah, yeah, and some of it's very much parallel to more fundamentalist movements in other religions, and Christianity is what I know best. Oftentimes fundamentalist movements are particularly appealing to people who are educated, usually first generation, higher education, people trained in technical subjects, and who are used to dealing with problems by sort of looking at the manual and figuring out how it applies to this problem. So Osama bin Laden was not a trained cleric. He'd had some formal religious education, but he was not a cleric. He was a civil engineer. When he bragged about the 9/11 attacks, he wasn't so much talking about theology. He was talking about engineering and why he thought the buildings would go down, and none of his friends did.
So let's take the notion of jihad, for example. I've read the Quran once and can hardly claim to be an expert, and I've read the New Testament and parts of the Old Testament. Putting the Old Testament aside,
It's pretty plenty.
the New Testament, the Quran is certainly, compared to the preachings of Jesus, a good deal more militant. It's telling people to go out and to spread the religion and to do it with the sword. That, of course, can be interpreted a variety of ways in the modern world. How would the traditional clerical class, the ulema, how would they have interpreted those, as opposed to the way these kind of radicals, do-it-yourself theologians?
Well, the key figure in sort of modern radical thought on jihad was actually an official in the Egyptian Ministry of Education. He was. His training was in education.
Is that Al-Banna?
No, Sayyid Qutb.
Oh, okay, he was a follower.
Yeah, yeah. But he was the one who sort of pushed the more radical view of jihad.
He was executed finally, wasn't he?
He was, yes. He was implicated in an assassination attempt on Nasser, I think. Well, the traditional view is, more or less identical to St. Augustine's view of just war. The verses in the Quran about jihad, as Muslim scholars understood very clearly, came in a quite specific context when Muhammad had been effectively driven out of his community and was at war with his native city. So the jihad...
Excuse me, can you hear that? Okay, go ahead, I'm sorry. Pick it up about 20 seconds earlier.
Okay. The verses in the Quran that deal with jihad date from a period when Muhammad was at war with his native city, which had basically driven him and his followers out. Many of them actually are there to encourage people to join the fight who were reluctant. But Muslim scholars understood this had a context, and so when this was developed into a formal law of war, the rules were basically there are two kinds of jihad. There's the greater jihad and there's the lesser jihad. The greater jihad is the jihad in Arabic means struggle. Greater jihad is against the lower self, and this already is emerging as an idea in the Quran. The lesser jihad is the one that involves fighting. Lesser jihad comes in two kinds, offensive and defensive. If the Islamic community is attacked, you have the right as a Muslim to fight in its defense. So this is the justification for somebody like Osama bin Laden. Fighting a jihad is, his understanding is the Islamic world is under attack from the West. Whether you agree with that or not, that's legalistic justification. Offensive jihad, if you were going to, let's say, conquer Texas in the name of Islam, that has to be declared by a legitimate authority. And it's not clear that there's a legitimate authority in the Islamic world now. For the Shia, it's the hidden imam, and he has been out of sight for the last 1,200 years. For the Sunnis, it would be the caliph, but there hasn't been a caliph since 1923, when the institution was abolished by Ataturk, the founder of the Turkish Republic.
So a specific war, in a way, has to be declared by a legitimate ruler who traditionally has been thought of as the caliph. So in the case, for example, of the Indian conqueror Aurangzeb, who certainly was a very pious and fierce in some ways Muslim, and carried the Mughal Empire into the He wasn't the caliph, but he must have justified his conquests on the basis of religion, did he not?
He might have. I would have to check whether he actually formally called it a jihad. I mean, not all war is jihad. You can't have jihad against other Muslims.
Right.
So this was a problem, an embarrassment. It was a civil war about 25 years after the death of the Prophet. And nobody could call that jihad. But there are rules governing it, and they're very much very similar to the rules embedded in modern international law.
If you are the caliph, say, so you have it in your power to declare jihad, are there grounds set out for when it's right to do that or when it's not?
You can't do it against Muslims. You can't do it against a state with which the Islamic State has treaty relations. You can do it against either people of the book, which means originally Christians and Jews, but was extended to include people like Hindus there were too many of them to slaughter. But you have to declare it formally. So bin Laden actually called in, I think it was an NBC TV crew, and gave them an interview and announced, appealed to the Americans to convert to Islam. And
so he thought he was doing it by the book.
He was doing it by the book.
He thought he was in the position of a caliph.
Yeah, I think he perhaps thought that the head of the Taliban counted, but this was very controversial among radical jihadi types. There was a lot of debate And I think the majority opinion among radicals was that the 9/11 attacks weren't legitimate. Some people accepted it, but it was not.
How did ISIS look back on it?
I think they've
certainly made similar kinds of threats.
They made similar kinds of threats. They were opposed to Al Qaeda. Those two groups were rivals. Al Qaeda at that point was allied with the United States.
You mean during the Afghan?
During the Syrian Civil War.
Syrian Civil War. Oh, you mean recently?
Recently, yes.
What's left of Al Qaeda? But these are people who don't call themselves Al Qaeda. They're kind of radical Muslims of a different stripe from ISIS. They descend. What you're saying is they descend from
Al Qaeda.
Same kinds of people.
They're close. They're very similar, so they hate each other.
So you don't think? I mean, if you look at after Muhammad's death, Muhammad, in his time, extends his sway over most of the Arabian Peninsula, but not beyond that. He dies. Right. So there is then this huge burst of conquest in the name of the Islamic religion, as far as we can tell, reading back into poorly documented times, and it spreads very rapidly. So there is a kind of tradition of unbounded holy war that you don't really find in Christianity, or would you think that's wrong?
Well, there was a tradition of conquest that everybody shared if they could manage it.
There was plenty of conquest with or without religion. Correct.
Right. Yes. And actually, it's not clear how much the conquests were ordered and how much they just sort of spontaneously happened. But they thought it was perfectly legitimate. Once things were established, the caliph would go out every year or two and do a jihad against the Byzantines and maybe capture some territory, or maybe not. The Ottomans, certainly, that was a source of their prestige, that they were the one Islamic state that was on the frontier conquering new territory for Islam.
Is that the term Ghazi sort of war?
Ghazi, it was holy, it's holy warriors, as good a translation as any. Mm-hmm. But there are rules about it, and at least in the formal law of war. You can't target civilians. Obviously, under certain circumstances, civilians get caught in the middle, but you can't deliberately target civilians. You can't use terror. You can't destroy valuable resources unnecessarily. So the classic example is you can't cut down fruit trees. That sort of thing. It's not very different from the laws of war as they're codified in modern international law.
So how would your kind of mainstream Muslim cleric look at jihad today? As something that belongs in the past?
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, Hussein Fadlallah, who was, in the newspapers he was the leader of Hezbollah, which he wasn't. He was a major figure who died a few years ago. And
so he's a Shia.
He's Shia, yeah. Mm-hmm. He said there's no Dar al-Harb, there's no territory where war is licit because Muslim nations belong to the United Nations, and that puts them into treaty relations with the whole rest of the world. Iran, even in the Iran-Iraq War, as far as I know, did not. I mean, they invoked classic symbols of jihad, but it was more specifically Shiite things. But they didn't see the war against Iraq as a jihad. So another example, which is quite conspicuous, is Ayatollah Khamenei, the present spiritual leader of Iran, argues that atomic weapons are un-Islamic. He's been very open about that and repeated it. And he's on very sound Islamic legal grounds because they're indiscriminate weapons, and you can't target civilians indiscriminately. And even so, bin Laden, it was just, okay, nobody really challenged, I mean, even the Americans, frankly, didn't challenge the legitimacy of attacking the Pentagon. We didn't like it, but, same question with the military target.
So what did bin Laden say about attacking the World Trade Center? Why was that a...
He argued that, it was a center of American economic power, but frankly, I mean, the U.S. attacks that kind of target when we're at war, and that Americans, by voting for the governments they had in effect enlisted themselves in the war against Islam. But as I said, I mean, the vast majority of Muslims worldwide did not buy that, and even among the radicals, it was controversial. So it's one thing to say blow up Marines in Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
It's another thing to attack civilian targets in the United States.
So you're skeptical that the Iranians are actually pursuing a military nuclear program?
I haven't seen any evidence that they are at this point. They were up until about 2003, and then they thought better of it.
What is to change the subject here, what is the frontier in the study of Islamic philosophy today?
The later period. The study of Islamic philosophy started in, say, the 13th century with Catholic philosopher theologians reading people like Averroes and Avicenna, and that tradition still exists in places like say Dominican institutions.
Avicenna would still be read in Dominican.
Oh yeah. I mean, I have friends who do medieval philosophy, and periodically, I'll get an email. Does this make sense to you in Arabic? I'll have some puzzling Latin thing. So that's the oldest tradition. Then there is a second philological tradition which is interested in tracing tracing the origins of Islamic philosophy back to Greek sources, and is primarily interested in the part of the Islamic philosophical tradition that is very much sort of Greco-Arabic, is what they refer to that kind of approach. So they're looking essentially at the people who were known to the Latins, and trying to identify the materials that they had access to. It traditionally tended to be rather philological in its approach. It's now more philosophical than it once was. The third approach has basically emerged in my time. There were a couple of key figures. One is a man named Henri Corbin, who's a French scholar, who died in the 1970s. So he was active between the 1930s and 1970s. He was interested in later Islamic philosophy and Shi'i philosophy of various sorts, and published either on his own or in collaboration with Iranian scholars, a lot of primary sources. So the Suhrawardi, the scholar that I work on, Corbin published his books. Now Corbin had rather odd ideas, in my humble opinion. I have to admit, minority humble opinion. So he was an associate of perennialists, Carl Jung, and so he was interested in things like archetypes and so on. So a lot of the things that he says are rather odd and have not convinced me. But he had a really fine eye for material. So you might not agree with anything he says about somebody, but that person is certainly interesting. His main disciple is a man named Sayyid Nasr, who was the head of the Imperial Iranian Academy of Philosophy in the 1970s, and consequently is now in the United States, who is a somewhat more moderate advocate of Corbin's approach. As I said, I'm a bit of a minority. I'm working on that material, but more certainly in terms of Suhrawardi, it's in a more philosophical and, as one of my colleagues put it, colorblind way. But that has focused on the people who are after the works, the people who are translated into Latin. So Suhrawardi is almost the first of these. He was a younger contemporary of Averroes. There was another major figure, Ibn Arabi, the Sufi theologian, who actually knew Averroes. He was a young man when Averroes was old, and his father was a friend of Averroes. But these traditions sort of merge in various ways and culminate in what Corbin christened the School of Isfahan, which is essentially a group of philosophers active in the 16th and 17th century. That tradition is actually still very much alive in Iran. I mean, you can go to Iran and study these philosophers.
But there are a lot of manuscripts that have not been studied, both in philosophy and science.
Oh yeah,
during
yeah.
this period. So there's a lot we don't know, and I guess a big project is to get to them and see what's
right.
there.
I mean, I have, I have graduate students. One of the better ones came to me saying he wanted to study Ghazali. I said, no, everybody studied Ghazali. Why don't you try Fakhruddin Razi? He's a contemporary of Suhrawardi, major theologian, and very little work has been done on him in the West. And there are dozens of figures who clearly were significant. And
are there huge troves of unread manuscripts that have to be sorted through?
Yeah.
And where would they be?
Iran, Turkey.
I mean, lying in libraries, archives?
Yeah, in libraries. Depending on which people and which period you're looking at. We know there's a scholar in Turkey who has published these large sort of bibliographical compendia of Ottoman scientists in various disciplines, and we know virtually nothing about these people. You look at the biographical dictionaries for Ottoman scholars, and it will say, and he was skilled in both rational and traditional sciences. Who were these people? What were they saying? There's a guy named Khalid Rawayheb, who's a professor at Harvard, who published a book on the history of Islamic logic. And what he did was he took a very narrow problem, which is basically this: A is equal to B is equal to C, therefore A is equal to C. This is very hard to explain in logical terms. And he looked at this problem in 60 different logicians going from the 9th century up to the beginning of the 20th. And the creative periods, at least with regard to this particular problem, are mostly times and people that we have not really looked at. And in this particular issue, the Muslims were more advanced than the Europeans up until the middle of the 19th century.
So there's a lot of work that remains to be done, and
There
we
is
can
indeed.
learn an awful lot more than we now know.
Yes, and every time somebody writes a book on a new author, the whole jigsaw puzzle changes.
Well, more power to you,
Thank
and
you.
thank you very much for being here.
It's my pleasure.
And we will be back again in 2 weeks' time talking to Peter Deere of Cornell about the scientific revolution. And until then, farewell.